everyone, and welcome to the Let's Talk Privacy and Technology series, where we feature guests, leading experts from the intersection of privacy and technology, and where we talk about things like privacy engineering and privacy enhancing technologies and cybersecurity. I'm Lourdes Turrecha. I am Santa Clara Law's Privacy Tech and Law Fellow and Adjunct Professor. And today, I'm very excited to have with us Daniel Barber, who is the CEO of DataGrail. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, no, great to be here. As we were joking earlier, I'm a big fan of Santa Clara. So for those of you listening in, and perhaps a few students as well, our first employee and intern was a Santa Clara grad. You can find Kyle today. He runs and leads all content on our marketing website. So excited to tune in for this one.
That's amazing, and it's a great shout out. Thank you for that. I myself have had a few interns coming from Santa Clara in my previous lives, working in-house. So let's kick it off with your journey in privacy and technology. I know it's been a while since you and I caught up, I think in a coffee shop in downtown San Francisco.
Yep. Yeah, which now is just not going to happen, but
no, it's not. We'll have to do this
virtually.
Yeah. Exactly. But I think we got into your story of how you got into DataGrail, but I'd love to hear your story, the background before that of how you ended up in privacy and technology, and why privacy and technology.
Yeah. So happy to share. So just the high level on DataGrail. Sort of purpose-built platform for GDPR, CCPA, and sort of continuous compliance with privacy regulations. We were founded in 2018, so early 2018. And prior to that, my background was not related to privacy at all, which is kind of an interesting path. So we had an interesting path to here, but an adjacent path. So my background and my two co-founders, we all spent time in really data products and applications. So I spent a couple of years at a company called Responsus. We're a platform for sending email, so promotional email in particular. So I apologize to everyone listening in. Those emails you're reading in your inbox are the ones you don't want to read. We may have sent those. And my other co-founder, Earl, who leads product, spent over a decade in ad tech. And then Ignacio, who leads engineering, spent a couple of years at Facebook doing backend there, and then time at HP Labs as well. And so between the three of us, we kind of all centered around what is a problem that exists that we're uniquely positioned to solve, given we understand the ecosystem of the different vendors that exist and operate businesses today, and where are businesses really going to struggle over the next 5 years, 10 years, and decades ahead. And what we landed on was privacy, because very clearly there's sort of two axes that we saw going into this market. There's really this complexity of legal and ongoing regulation, right? So many of the folks who may be legal practitioners on, listening to this podcast, the regulation hasn't stopped at just the GDPR. In fact, it's compounded, right? So if you just look at Gartner's research in this area, you'll find that, data protection today exists for roughly 10% of humans on the planet, right? So if we think about GDPR being a trailblazer there, and for our friends in Europe, and CCPA being really a staple for US privacy, that is only 10% of the population of the planet. And if you look at Gartner's research, they suggest that by 2023 that number goes to 65%. So that's just very difficult for businesses to figure out, because the regulatory requirements are all different. And then on the other axes, you have this ongoing technical complexity that exists when businesses have an enormous amount of different data sources, systems, applications that they use, including the one that we're recording this webinar on today. And so, if you think about that, data from Okta is probably the best proxy for the complexity here. The average Okta customer of 4 years uses 190 applications. And so if you look at the average Okta customer, today they use 88 applications, and that's up 21% from just 3 years ago. So if companies are using hundreds of different applications, which ones contain personal data, and how do you actually provide that transparency and control that a user or a consumer, it kind of comes to expect in the year 2020.
Thank you for that, Daniel. And is that how you ultimately decided you wanted to sit in the intersection of privacy and security with, you had that conversation with your two other founders, you had the experience in data, in advertising, in marketing, and you saw that with the increasing number of privacy regulations and the Gartner research that tells us that 10% will go up to 65% or something like that. There's just this market opportunity there. It sounds like you saw that market opportunity like few others and seized the opportunity, but I don't mean to speak for you.
Yeah. No, it's that's pretty accurate. I think the other thing that we saw, right, was this sort of first wave of privacy tech. There were some existing providers in the market, but as you would expect when you have a first wave, a lot of the vendors tried to solve every possible problem, and naturally applied sort of workflow solutions to kind of address those problems, right? So even just simple problems of what systems do we have? How do we develop an inventory of systems? This is common privacy sort of practice 101, right? The spreadsheet. And so that practice, there were tools that were in the market that sort of applied, that manual process and sort of took it to some form of application. But what we're seeing now is this sort of second wave of technology vendors. And so we looked at the existing players in the market and saw a market opportunity to really automate the entirety of the work, which is a significant improvement for folks in security, and obviously reduces the risk for folks in privacy.
Absolutely. And as someone who has worked in-house as a privacy practitioner and who's worked in cybersecurity with partnering with our information security teams, I feel that pain, and it's an innovation that was a long time coming.
Yeah.
So thank you. I appreciate that. Now, I was just talking to an investor about how privacy is the new technical debt that we need to pay back and pay back soon. Otherwise, we're just going to drown in all the compliance work that's coming with CCPA and CCPA 2.0 and all the global privacy laws that are coming in Brazil and all over the world. Well, let me pivot a little bit and ask you about how you feel about the future. We talked about the first wave and the second wave of privacy tech vendors. How do you feel, or what are some of your predictions about the future of privacy and technologies?
Yeah. So, as a layperson, right? So I'm not a lawyer. So all the lawyers tuning in and yourself, I'm more informed on the technical side of how the market shifts there. But if you look at sort of the simplest thing you can do, and I encourage all of you to take a path at this. If you go to your personal inbox and you search the words transparency or control, or a combination of both, you'll find that the privacy policy updates of almost all of the leading consumer brands that you interact with use those two words. So really, what consumers are expecting comes down to, what type of information is a company collecting about me, and I want to have control over that information. And so, if you look at today, they don't have control, right? So, I was on NPR in January talking about a survey that we did of 2,000 consumers, where we found that 62% of them, they would unsubscribe to an email, and then they got another email. And that just shows that clearly the consumer has kind of lost trust in the brands that they interact with. And so I think there's this change, this age of privacy, if you will, where, the consumer is going to expect increasing amounts of transparency and control into the way businesses use their information. And vendors will need to move quickly to provide that functionality, because leading consumer brands will want it. And those that actually adopt it will likely see competitive advantage, right? In the way that they interact with the consumer's information. And you can see this even from consumer brands that perhaps you wouldn't think of, right? Yesterday, when I went to fill up, and I'm going to use petrol, sorry, that's just my Australian background, I can't help it. When I went to fill up the petrol tank, the petrol station is asking for my email address to get, a discount, right? So now the petrol company that I associated as just, filling up the car is now collecting my personal information for a discount. Now, is that viable? Maybe, but I would like to know what they're going to do with that information. And that's not actually disclosed on the pump. So what happens after I put my email address? Obviously, they send me emails, but what else? Where does it go? So I think consumer brands will really, some of them will take the lead in taking a strong position in this area, and technology providers will really have to catch up. And I think if you look at the existing market, they won't. So I think you're going to see a large number of folks continue to get funded in this area, and perhaps the existing providers will try to patch up some of the work that they've produced to sort of catch up to those new wave of providers that we're seeing on the market now.
There's so many ways we can go from here, and I want to jump to my inclination to ask you, so do you see the consumer privacy tech space kind of catching up with the enterprise privacy tech landscape? But we can get to that in a little bit. I do want to take the moment to agree with all the research that you mentioned, with Pew Research earlier this year, telling us, I've been tracking this for years, consumer privacy sentiment. And this year, it was particularly encouraging to see the numbers spike up, where they revealed that more than half of Americans have abandoned an online service due to privacy concerns. And that's not even as high as the number that you mentioned. And then even in the midst of the pandemic, you would think that public health is a good enough reason to use, an app or a service. But research also tells us that 70% of Americans refuse to use a contact tracing app due to privacy concerns. So I completely, I see. I think the developing and changing consumer privacy sentiment is one of the reasons why there is a rise in privacy tech. We may not be seeing it in the consumer privacy tech space yet, but this demand is being trickled down to the businesses, and we've seen some businesses respond and take the stance that privacy is a fundamental human right, and use privacy as a competitive advantage. And we've seen all the ads, the Apple ads, for instance, from the past few years, and in their latest product reveals as well. But so let me ask you, it makes sense that the businesses are scrambling because there is the regulatory requirement that the GDPR and CCPA and other privacy laws. Do you see this finally trickling into the consumer tech space, or do you think it will still take a while?
Yeah, so I'm likely biased here. So I set that as a context because I've spent a lot of time in the enterprise. So I just have more familiarity and experience there in my interactions with businesses. However, I do think if we historically look at areas that are of highest sensitivity, right? So if you think about credit reporting is probably the highest sensitive area that consumers are aware of and concerned about, which is why, credit reporting agencies, when they do experience breaches, which we hope they don't, there's usually a lot of concern in that area when that kind of thing happens. And I think the only area that's probably more sensitive is biotech and information like you're suggesting about contact tracing. People get very concerned about that. But when it comes to an individual's privacy and their information that is shared, I struggle to get to the point where people would pay for that. And so I have that position because I just, if you look at comparative segments, so if you think about folks like LifeLock or other businesses that have been involved in sort of protecting, information and security and these types of things. There are very viable businesses there, but I just wonder if the consumer would actually pay for a subscription type business for their privacy. I'm yet to be convinced that that's viable. Although I do see, a number of businesses certainly making an attempt at doing that. And personally, I would love if someone could provide, an experience to do that. But I do see challenges with also the model of that scaling, just across every business. There has to be adoption there as well. And I think there's been, at least from our customers, so consumer brands, a lot of friction and a lot of resistance to a consumer privacy company pushing or persuading or advocating for change. At least that's just from my perspective.
Yeah, I share a lot of the sentiments that you shared. I think there's a lot of education to be made still. I completely agree.
Yeah.
I think the business model is also something that's tricky that needs to be figured out. It might be a matter of figuring out the right business model for that and clearly articulating a value that resonates with consumers, because the research is there to back up that they value privacy. It's just a matter of figuring out in what ways, right? It's a very, because privacy is a very complex subject matter. It's not about the handing over of data. So there are different ways to tackle the problem. With that in mind, what do you think is the biggest privacy and technology challenge or issue that we're facing today?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said that, digital transformation and looking at, businesses and how they move to the cloud.
Right.
Not now.
Yeah.
Right. Traditional, go ahead.
And what changed that? Are you saying that the pandemic has changed that answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that has pros and cons. The pros certainly outweigh the cons, but when you look at the traditional architecture of the enterprise, right, there are large numbers of on-premise applications that are homegrown and built to operate the organization's, perhaps identity management or transactional type of databases. This type of problem, or I should say instance environment, creates a lot of problems for privacy, right? So, and I think that's an area that there was significant innovation to try to help businesses there, but really it's backward compatibility, right? So focused on how do we address these internal databases and how do we bring the old traditional, perhaps Fortune 50, Fortune 100 business into the modern age of privacy. That's quite challenging when they've got a hybrid environment, some on-premise, some cloud. That's changed rapidly. So I think what lies ahead, and this is where I'm probably most excited, is, the future of where this goes is our information and the transfer of that information between businesses. That's what will actually drive change, right? So business transfer of personal information between entities. We're a decade away from that, though. So I think this transformation that has happened in the last 6 months has accelerated that plan. I would have said we are 2 decades away from that, without that. But I think now the ability for a consumer to say, hey, I want my information to go from X to Y, portability requests for the lawyers tuning in, that starts to become more real, given the transformation that we've actually just seen.
Exactly. I mean, just before the pandemic, in the B2B, even in the cybersecurity space, we saw digital transformation as top of mind for CISOs and CIOs. And so after the pandemic, where, now that COVID-19 has accelerated digital transformation for everyone, what would you say is the next biggest issue that we're grappling with today, or the biggest issue now post pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I did a webinar with a security leader from Okta, Chris, 10 days ago now. His concern, I think I share the concern for other security leaders, is that this application, Zoom and Slack and many others, and as we all move our lives to this dynamic workplace, it supports the ability for an employee to simply install other applications and share data that perhaps shouldn't be shared between different applications. The amount of data that goes from one application to another is increasing, right? So there are app stores for almost any application you install in your computer. And so those will share data between systems, right? With often no permissions or no limitations of the user just going and installing new apps. So that's a concern. And I think third-party risk will continue to be a concern. But the transfers of information between those systems, as this sort of digital transformation goes and gets sort of more wind, will continue because the modern worker is not in the office anymore, so they're sitting at home with perhaps security not close by or IT not close by, so they're installing what they need, which does have its own concerns, especially related to privacy.
Absolutely. And with the acceleration of digital transformation, that on the one hand, that's good, and it's made, there's opportunities for cybersecurity and privacy tech companies out there, but there are also a lot of companies who are ill-prepared on the flip side of that coin, which opens us all up to privacy and security vulnerabilities.
Yep.
You mentioned third-party vendor management as one of those risk areas or problems. I also teased out of your response, the need to engineer privacy and security into these tools and holding those third parties into that standard as one of those critical problems that we need to really start pushing. We've been talking about privacy engineering for a while, but now it becomes even more important, right? Like with tools like Zoom, which went through the media for all of the privacy concerns and problems that were raised. What is your, as a CEO, as a founder of a privacy tech startup, what is your position on privacy engineering, and how do you ensure that your company and your teams are kind of leading the way in terms of how you build your product, especially that you were in the intersection of privacy and security?
That's a good question. So I'm going to take a bold statement on that one. I'm of the position that I think privacy engineering is likely where we'll see a large number of businesses gain competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. But I think our traditional tools, DPIA assessments, are basic. Like, they're assessments, right? They're static. Even with current tooling, they don't really work very well, and they need to be continually updated. I mean, it's job creation. That's good. But they're just not very effective. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to see a significant improvement over the next, really 12, 24 months in this area, because, which is related to privacy engineering, right? That people will be able to assess in an automated fashion the risk that applications they're building pose from a privacy standpoint. I think, there are providers out there that are trying to sell to the engineering buyer. And I think that makes sense. However, that's limited from a standpoint of the consumer brand may not think about engineering in the same way that, a technology company does. And so I think trying to force a standard, as we've seen before through many consumer engineering products, probably won't work. So I think setting the construct at an enterprise level of how you could do assessments in an automated fashion is far more effective. But today these things don't exist. So I'm talking in all hypotheticals.
Right. They're certainly, I haven't seen a very mature DPIA
No.
privacy risk tool. I know it's some
No.
early stage ones.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big things that's come up about it is that, you know, all the DPAs, the data protection authorities in the world, and even in the US with the FTC and the California AG, everyone has different requirements as to what should be in a DPIA or a PRA. And so I would like to see, you know, whoever wants to get into there, it would be interesting to see how fully automated it could go, knowing there might still be the art there that would be needed. I do want it to get as close to, you know, as close as possible to being an automated process, but how do we account for new guidance from the FTC or the California AG or the new? It's a complicated.
No, it is.
Yeah.
It is. I think the privacy community deserves it, quite frankly. It's really overdue. And I think the existing, so coming from, again, from a technology position, looking at other areas of business, right? And just looking at how, you know, how if you're in customer success or if you're in marketing or if you're in sales, how so many of the activities that you would do from a day-to-day basis have been significantly improved from technology, from a productivity standpoint. And then you look and you go into the world of the privacy lawyer or the privacy community and you look at what they're working with. It's primitive, needs to be improved. And it's overdue. Like the IAPP do amazing work. And quite frankly, I'm sort of looking forward to, you know, a place where the community has the tools they need to actually do their job at a much more efficient and effective way. There's sort of been resistance in the community around automation because I think historically that probably hasn't worked that well. But I think, you know, now there's a place where it could. And so kind of excited about that, frankly, because it's what the community deserves.
Absolutely. It's really painful when, like you said, you know, a lot of the things that privacy practitioners have been doing for years are things that could be automated, like gathering the facts needed to make an assessment, for instance. And so, yeah, it's long overdue for tools like this. And I've seen, and you made another point about, you know, it hasn't really worked out for them. That's also another sentiment that I've heard over and over. And the reason that big companies have reported building their own internal tools because the market just wasn't there yet in terms of providing them what they needed. But I mean, it's exciting. The privacy profession certainly deserves it. What is your advice to those who are, you know, who might be interested in this space, who are just looking to break into not just privacy, but privacy and technology or privacy tech in general? What would you say to them? I mean, what do you wish your younger self had gotten? What types of advice do you wish your younger self had gotten a few years ago when you were starting out in this field?
Yeah. So, you know, what's interesting, like I said, I didn't see myself going into privacy tech. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, you know, would you have started a company in privacy tech? I would have said definitely not. Now, I've wanted to start a company for a long time. So, yeah, it's a natural sort of evolution. But starting in privacy tech definitely wouldn't have seen that. But I think, for founders or folks that are considering businesses or looking to get into the community, you go where the problems are, right? And like I said, I think if you look at other functions within an organization, many of the functions have seen significant investment to improve the overall effectiveness of their job. Legal and security. Now, security has seen a lot of investment, but at the intersection of privacy and security, which has historically been quite gray, right? What actually does that mean? Hasn't seen a lot of investment. And I think privacy in general has really come to force in the last decade. And you can see that because large consumer brands, but also large consumer communities, our friends at Facebook in particular, have had challenges. And it's made the consumer aware of what's going on, which means that the challenge of the enterprise is really real. And there's an enormous number of challenges for an enterprise today to really maintain or be continuously compliant. I often hear security leaders or privacy leaders say, "Oh yes, we're GDPR compliant." What does that mean? That's a really hard statement to make. And within a few minutes, I can poke holes at a few of the different points, and there's no way that they're actually compliant. But I think that's because the sheer number of problems that they're trying to grapple with is not trivial. And so, I think it is an exciting time in privacy. So I'm excited to see what you're doing as well, because I do think there needs to be new ideas coming into the category. Folks that have experience at the intersection of legal and technology, because they're more likely to see actual innovation there, as opposed to what we've typically seen, which is the move from the consultant to some form of spreadsheet that's a bit better than the last one.
Exactly. And it's very sage advice. Go where the problems are. I mean, that's where the money is. And it's not just about the money. It's also about making a difference, right? Like privacy problems are some of the biggest problems that we have today. I think it only is second to global warming is what most research say. In terms of navigating, we talked about the intersection of privacy and technology. Let's kind of hone in further in the intersection of privacy and security, and what you see, why that intersection, and what you've seen. What would you say is the difference between the two? I know I've worked in both. I'm a privacy practitioner. I've been in the cybersecurity industry, and it always surprised me that I had very, privacy experts and security experts who knew not much about the other domain. And so I wanted to take this chance to ask you, can you give us an explainer on privacy and security, and what you think is the relationship between the two and the distinction between the two domains?
Yeah, so we talked about this before, and I think there's a change in the makeup in the enterprise. It's unclear who owns privacy. The traditional privacy professional has been, and again, I'm going to generalize here, so hopefully no one takes offense to it, but typically non-technical, with a legal background, which is powerful. Ultimately, the buck stops with the legal team, right? They own the privacy policy, more than likely. And in large organizations, you see the privacy team break out, perhaps from the legal team, to where they become their own entity. But they're still likely a legal entity, right? Meaning, unlikely to have technical leaders to implement technology, which then there lies the problem. So, what you saw with, again, V1 providers is this focus then on IT, because they're the implementers of technology. And this is the traditional group. However, I think what we're seeing is security is leaning in to the privacy community and sort of lending a hand, so to speak, because there's lots of problems there. and people go where the problems are.
Right.
And I think the CISO is now more involved in privacy. We've got probably 30% of our customers where the CISO is actually running the privacy program.
I believe.
And yeah, and it's I don't have a position on whether that's a good decision or not good decision. What I would rather just say is that it's very powerful when you see the security team working hand in hand with privacy. And unfortunately, that's not the case in most cases. But when it does happen, it's a really powerful thing. And it creates
And it's a necessary.
synergy in the solution. Correct. It's a necessary thing because the implementation of a next generation technology is not going to happen with the privacy team operating in a silo.
Right.
And I think that's the part that that has changed. We see the next generation of privacy professionals looking for something else than the spreadsheet. And so to that effect, they need help from the security team also to evaluate, is this the right tool for us? What risk does it expose if we implement this technology? And I think the existing providers, you see quite a lot of risk there because perhaps the tool was designed really from a more workflow orientated position, which makes sense, frankly.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Privacy has historically been coming from the legal function. I don't think it's just for lawyers. I think it's a very cross-functional field.
Yes.
You know, we need the engineers, the technical folks, the compliance folks, the lawyers, the policymakers, the business people. There's just something for everyone in privacy, right? It's not just, but historically it makes sense because of privacy laws and privacy principles coming out of the legal field. And so it's made
Yep.
sense that it's come from that. I'm not surprised though that you're seeing CISOs taking on privacy, more and more of them. My first job straight out of law school was actually building privacy for a Fortune 300 company, was actually within the CISO organization. So that's
Yep.
not
So you've seen it too.
exactly. Well, we are almost out of time here. I wanted to give you an opportunity to share whatever you want with the audience about, where they can find you, and DataGrail. And if you have any closing words for us that, you'd like to share with us, please take it away.
Yeah, so you can find me on the old version, the old world privacy version of the internet, the white pages of the internet, otherwise known as LinkedIn. So you can find me there, just Daniel Barber. And you can also find me on Twitter. I have a very unusual Twitter handle, which is GuyJinDan. I've lived in a whole host of countries, and so background there, I'm basically a foreigner in every country. So you can find me on Twitter at GuyJinDan. Or you can shoot me an email if you're really ambitious, daniel@datagrail.io.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Daniel.
Of course. Happy to join you.
Thanks.